This makes him look like a doting, loving father, and it softens his image with the populace. And, having watched those videos myself, I think it's pretty effective.
It is an image that they're trying to sell. It doesn't really reflect the reality. And a lot of the stuff we hear from former North Korean officials, it is quite a bit of a horror house in the North Korean government.
The daughter of the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, Kim Joo-ae, was first introduced to the world in 2022. But in recent months, she's been in the public eye more frequently, either in official state media or at high-profile events. So is she being positioned as the country's first female leader? Or is there another strategy at play? I'm Mariko in Singapore, and this is Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service. Twice a week, we bring you Asia Pacific stories, unpacked by those who know them best. And today I have our Korea correspondent, Jake Kwon in Seoul. I also have Rupert Wingfield Hayes. He's a former Asia correspondent for the BBC who was detained by the Kim regime for about 3 days in 2016. Welcome both. Let's start with you, Jake, and tell me what we know about the daughter of Kim Jong-un, because we look up how old she is, even how old Kim Jong-un is, and there's no kind of verified source on it, is there?
No. Best we understand is that she was born in 2013, so that should make her about 13 years of age. And if you look at the latest images of her on North Korean state media, she is finally surpassed her father in terms of the height. She really looks like she's hitting the growth spurt. And she looks a lot like her own mother. And she usually appears in leather coat, sunglasses, or designer blouses, which is, probably out of reach for most North Koreans. And she's wearing her hair long, which is forbidden for most young women in North Korea. So she really is someone special. And the more and more we see of her, the more and more she is taking a center stage right beside her father, which is quite extraordinary.
And what do you make of this, Rupert? Is she groomed to succeed Kim Jong-un?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be really interested to know what Jake thinks about this in terms of North Korea being not just a family regime, it's also an extremely chauvinist ideology. And so the idea of a woman running North Korea is at odds with what you would expect. And so the fact that Kim Jong-un's daughter appears to be taking such a prominent role and being groomed for succession strikes a lot of people as rather odd, because it has been reported, although never confirmed, that he has an older son born in 2010 and perhaps a third child born in 2017 may also be a boy. Again, we just don't know. This is the most secretive family and society on earth in many ways. But if there is a boy in the background, a lot of people think that at some stage that boy will come out in the open, and it's much more likely that there will be a boy succeed him, keeping the Kim family name.
It's really hard to understate how secretive this family is and how much of a taboo inside North Korea. You can get killed for mentioning some of the details of the Kim family, like, who was the Kim Jong-un's mother, how old is Kim Jong-un, and had Kim Jong-un's father have any other wives. I mean, these are all considered very much a secret. It's kind of funny how we even found out about Kim Joo-ae through Dennis Rodman, who was the NBA star, right? After he visited Pyongyang and played, some basketball game in front of the dictator. So it really shows how little we actually know. And each time we talk about North Korea, how much we are kind of engaging in tea leaf reading here. A lot of our information is through rumors and watching what we can see that North Korea decide to reveal to us.
Yeah, I was actually recently talking to a North Korean defector, a woman who said that she couldn't possibly imagine a woman ever ruling North Korea. But if it is not to succeed Kim Jong-un, how should we read, why this teenager basically is hanging out at very high profile events?
This makes him look like a doting, loving father, and it softens his image with the populace. And having watched those videos myself, I think it's pretty effective. He does look like a doting, loving father. She's an attractive young woman, and I think for the Kim family image, which is really a sort of royal family. If you think of the British royal family and how much good the children of William and Catherine, for example, do for the British royal family, then having his daughter at his side certainly, I think, just enhances that image of them as this perfect family.
No, I gotta agree. I mean, a lot of what we see is what North Korea wants to put out there. A lot of this is personality cult and image making. And I think Kim Jong-un, as soon as he debuted on the stage, he really wanted to sell this image of a father. He tried to almost model himself after his own grandfather, who is still revered inside North Korea. You see it in his hairstyle, you see it in his fashion. A lot of this, like I said, it is an image that they're trying to sell. It doesn't really reflect the reality. And a lot of the stuff we hear from former North Korean officials, it is quite a bit of a horror house in the North Korean government. Kim Jong-un, from what is described, is a very he likes to throw tantrums. He is quite arbitrary, and there's a reign of terror going on inside Pyongyang. But at least what we see on the television is one of a very loving and benevolent guy.
Yeah, we tried to contact a North Korea's embassy here in Singapore asking for a comment and a response for this podcast. As we've all been saying, it's really hard to get information directly from Pyongyang, but on the record, state media has previously described defectors as traitors and human scum. Also, the country's ambassador to the United Nations, Kim Song, last year responded to claims by defectors of widespread repression, describing those claims as a burlesque of intrigue and fabrication. And this defector that I spoke to, she also said she remembered that day when Kim Jong un came to power. I think he was only 27, that was in 2011. And she said the North Korean public thought he really reminded everyone of his grandfather, and people just were hopeful that maybe he would be less severe, less harsh than his father. But of course, it hasn't really been the case. And Rupert, I want you to share your personal experience because you were detained there for 3 days. It must have been quite terrifying experience if you don't mind sharing with our audience.
Yeah, I was detained at Pyongyang International Airport at the end of a 10-day trip a reporting trip to the country where we had been following a group of Nobel laureates and on a lecture tour to universities in the North Korean capital. And I was then detained and interrogated overnight, and I was accused of insulting the North Korean regime, and they threatened to put me on trial. I think largely through luck of working for a large news organization, and also that the Korean Workers' Party Congress was about to happen the next week, I was, after 3 days, expelled from the country and not put on trial. But it was an absolutely, at the time, terrifying experience. And so, you had that feeling that, well, I could just disappear for months. That didn't happen to me, but it certainly gives you a sense of how powerless the individual is in the face of such an absolutist regime.
Jake, the number of defectors, though, from North Korea to South Korea has actually fallen, hasn't it? So can you tell us why that is? Does that mean that people are actually more satisfied with Kim's regime and how things are within the country?
I think it is safer to assume that it's not through the lack of will, but strengthening of the border between China. This is where most of the North Korean people escape. They go north towards the Chinese border, which is a lot more porous, and then they go through China to get better job and better opportunity. A lot of these people leave North Korea for economic reasons, really, primarily. And then some of them decide to move all the way down to South Korea, where people speak the same language. They're not being hunted by Chinese police officers, and they are essentially, as soon as they walk into South Korea, they're given South Korean citizenship and passport. What we understand about kind of how things are inside North Korea is through these people telling us what their life is like there. Recently, there was a kind of testimony, a memoir from a former North Korean diplomat. And there's a whole chapter in his memoir, and it just tells one after another, one official after another getting executed by anti-aircraft guns, and their body is not even recognizable after the killing. And how this is done in a very public fashion. They bring out all the North Korean officials to witness this killing as to kind of drive fear into them. And in terms of the lower levels, there has been a lot more control over what they can see and hear. The law around sharing and distributing South Korean movies and TV shows have really tightened to the point that distribution can be punished by death.
What do you make of this increasing number of punishment, Rupert, of watching, sharing foreign entertainment, foreign content? Does it reflect the regime's insecurity or confidence?
It's a really difficult question to get right, I think, because when I've interviewed defectors in the past, both in South Korea and in China, one thing's clear is that I remember one defector saying to me, we all know that South Korea is a lot richer than North Korea. What really upsets people in North Korea is we know now people in China live much better than we do, and so it's not like there isn't knowledge of the outside world, but there is, I think, also a sense that if everybody in North Korea has access to the internet and the outside world, and I've seen the way the internet works in North Korea, and it's not an internet, it is an intranet where information is very, very tightly controlled only to the top tier of society, then that absolutely suggests to me that they believe that if there was real free access to information, that it would be a threat to the regime. It has to be that. When I remember interviewing defectors back in 2016, they told stories of what life had been like during Kim Jong-il's time, at the end of the Kim Jong-il regime, so Kim Jong-un's father, where things had been pretty loose and where trade with China had grown dramatically, and how this whole private economy had grown up in North Korea, and where there was I remember one person telling me about the currency the currency of choice instead of cash was choco pies, which they would go to China and get choco pies and use them on the black market, which is a type of chocolate cake. And I was amazed. People told me about going to the border with China and using a mobile phone with a SIM card from China to call their relatives in South Korea. And I was just absolutely astonished that this sort of freedom existed below the official level in North Korea. But I wonder whether this is actually a reaction against that. That's Kim Jong-un saw the loosening of society, and like many authoritarian regimes, thought if this goes on further, this movement across the border, these mobile phone cards coming into North Korea, the amount of trade that's going on freely with China, whether this ultimately will be a threat to the regime. And that's why we have seen this hardening of attitudes and punishments for all sorts of infringements of official policy.
Rupert, you and I covered the various Trump-Kim summits in Singapore, Hanoi, and DMZ. I might have got the order wrong, but also there was that summit between Moon Jae-in and Kim Jong-un at the border between the two countries. And at one point, Kim Jong-un seems quite eager to open up to building relationship with the rest of the world, but now he's gone all cold again. So can you remind our audience what happened in that kind of shift in his attitude?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you think of North Korea regime's attitude to the outside world, you've also got to think of the Korean Peninsula's geographic location and the history. And the fact is, the Korean Peninsula is jammed between China and Japan, and has historically always felt squeezed by those two Asiatic powers, and has had to balance relations, always needing to have good relations with China, but always wanting to have also another power outside to balance that dependence on China. And I think what Kim Jong-un saw Donald Trump as a potential alternative sponsor, an alternative balance for Beijing, so that he wouldn't have to be so overly dependent on Beijing, which he clearly doesn't like. And I think he, genuinely wanted to negotiate some sort of recognition from the United States and some sort of, at least détente with the United States, and perhaps some investment and greater aid. And the point at which it all failed, you were there, I wasn't. I was in Singapore. I wasn't allowed to Hanoi because of my previous history with North Korea. That it all fell apart, and that it came down to it that North Korea was not going to give up its nuclear weapons. That's an absolute baseline. I think North Korea is never going to give up its nuclear weapons as long as that state exists and the Kim dynasty exists.
I mean, if you look at Hanoi, the collapse of that summit, and all we understand is that this is probably the most traumatic event in Kim Jong-un's life. When he goes to sleep, he probably kicks his blanket thinking about that moment. I mean, him going to Hanoi was a huge gamble on its own. There was a lot of advertising going on internally. You look at the state media, they all talk about what a great kind of travel, that trip that Kim is going to go, and then he's going to win something big from the US leader. And then when that collapses, all of that coverage just suddenly disappears. He makes his way back with his tail between his legs. And, that long train ride back to Pyongyang was probably a very humiliating one. And, we saw a lot of officials who were arranging this negotiation with Trump has gone missing since then. And we don't know what happened to them. Very most likely that they were purged, scapegoated for this failure. And so for Kim Jong-un to really stick out his neck again, there has to be something really concrete, something really promising there. And we know what he probably wants, which is to recognize that he's a nuclear state, that he can, someone telling him, a US leader, Donald Trump, telling him that, we'll recognize that you are a nuclear power, you can keep your nukes, and we will also lift your sanctions, and we'll bring you back into our fold, and maybe we'll sign a peace treaty.
Jake, what about the role of South Korea? Because under the current president, President Lee, he's taking a friendlier approach towards Pyongyang. He's considering, for example, easing access for South Korean public to read North Korea's only newspaper, Rodong Shimbun. Given Pyongyang has gone all cold towards South Korea, how should we read this contrast?
Well, right now, as far as we know, there is no relationship whatsoever. North Korea has sworn off any communication with the South. We heard Kim Jong-un saying that South Korea is just another country that we're engaged in war with. There is no reunification with the South. Don't think of them as compatriots, even though, 70 years ago, this was one country. And for South Korean people, South Korean government, of course, there's a lot of willingness to engage North with current administration, but there just simply isn't many options. The new president Lee Jae-myung described it as a needle-sized hole, and actually smaller than a needle-sized hole for any maneuvering to engage the North. I think there's actually very big kind of risk in engaging North and going all in here because his predecessor, Moon Jae-in, really went all in with all his political chips in North Korean relationship. And when that failed, that cost him his government. The next president was not from the same party. And a lot of people attribute that loss to the failure of North Korea policy. So the new president, Lee Jae-myung, he doesn't want to stake his political capital on this. So his messaging has been pretty clear that, any kind of breakthrough with North Korea is kind of come from Washington.
As we've been talking about it, the country is full of mystery. It's just all speculation. But if you have that crystal ball, I just want to ask, what could be next for North Korea? Could we see more surprises? Could we actually see that 15, 13, 14, who knows, year-old teenage daughter one day running North Korea?
I defer to Jake's greater knowledge of Korean culture than mine, but I would say my gut feeling is no. I mean, I think the one chance of her becoming the supreme leader of North Korea is if she is the only child. If Kim Jong-un only has one daughter and doesn't have any other children, then she's, I guess, the only option. But if there is a son that is maybe only 8 or 9 years old, who's born in 2017, or another son that we don't know about, then I think in the future we're going to see that boy emerge onto the stage.
Rupert is right. I mean, whenever we report on North Korea, I think a clear rule about reporting on North Korea is never make a certain statement, because we are all kind of reading the tea leaves, and we can say like, oh, this is going to happen, and then next moment, tomorrow we can see, maybe Kim Joo-ae will be declared the heir. As far as we understand, it's a deeply, deeply sexist society. Women are considered beneath men there. And even though she is part of what they call the Baekdu bloodline, that she is direct descendant of their founder Kim Il Sung, and this is a huge capital behind her. A lot of the North Korean watchers that I speak to, they're quite, uncertain. I think it really comes like about 50-50. Some people do think that she has a chance. Some people think that there's just no way. But I think the reason this is such a big area of speculation. This is what a lot of North Korean watchers are fascinated with, is because I think a lot of people are asking whether when she ascends to the throne, can that signal some kind of change for the North Korean society? To have a woman on as a leader, will that signal some kind of openness of the society, openness of the North Korean political system? And but to be honest, seeing her inspecting the troops alongside her father, wearing leather coat and sunglasses, and looking a little bored by all these politics, perhaps not.
Well, 50-50 there. I guess that's as good as it gets when it comes to speculating on North Korea. Even both of you had that crystal ball. Thank you so much for sharing your insights, Jake and Rupert.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having us.
You've been watching Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service with me, Mariko Oi, in Singapore. If you have any questions or thoughts on what we've covered in this episode or any other stories from the region, please leave us a comment below. You can also get in touch with us on email, asiapacific@bbc.co.uk. And you know the drill, click like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.